Introduce the speakers because he's a buddy, and because I want you to know that lots of speakers come from there, not because I'm special. It's because a number of our alumni and parents help me out in this Tuesday night affair. So I want to thank all the parents of Blair and realize in life you don't do things alone. People really help. And it's part of your education. Parents care about what you're learning in the Blair Academy. So Doug is going to say a few words about our speaker, and then we'll move
on. I'm Doug Roberts. My son is Alex. Out there as well. One of the things that kind of like when I was young, we always dreamed of adventure. We dreamed of becoming astronauts, but at that point it wasn't feasible. So what we decided was to, if you couldn't go up into space, you go down into space, and we started exploring the word of offshore wreck diving off the coast of New Jersey. And I happened to bump into Richie Kohler. And then what happened is we kept doing this, and then we finally dove the pinnacle of the Andrea Doria, but we also happened to discover the U-boat, which was written up in shadow divers, which we'll talk about. So that was the pinnacle of my career. I then got married, had kids. Richie went on to bigger and better things. From that, he became host of Deep Sea Detectives. He was also the central character, and he's still making movies. He was eventually somewhere within Fox. There's still a script on the table. It's supposed to basically star a movie with Richie as well. And I think at that point he wanted Brad Pitt to play him, but we're not sure about that at that time. In addition to that, he's gone even beyond that. He's done the Titanic, also the Britannic, and the Olympic, which are other sister shipwrecks, tons of other ones. I can't really go into what Richie's going to talk about, but kind of like when you dream of adventure, that's the life that Richie Kohler has lived. So with that, I'll turn this over to my buddy Richie Kohler.
Doug said something really important about dreaming. And I'm still a dreamer. When I was younger than you, I dreamed of being an astronaut. Just like everybody from my generation. We watched Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. It was the most amazing thing in our lives. To think that somebody could be propelled across the universe and land on another foreign body, plant the American flag, it was breathtaking. I think every kid, boy and girl, across the planet wanted to be Neil Armstrong. They wanted to be an astronaut. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and it didn't look at that point like I was going to be an astronaut. I was about 8 years old, and the same summer that Neil Armstrong took those steps on the moon, my dad learned how to scuba dive. Now my father is a wonderful man. He's an enabler. He's the type of man, whether it's a shotgun or a chainsaw or scuba equipment, he encouraged his children to learn how to use it, learn how to use the equipment safely, and then encourage you. And in that, he enabled me to live a dream, to become weightless. As I think you may have mentioned at dinner, instead of becoming an astronaut, I became an aquanaut. And I fell in love with diving. It has guided my life for the last 39 years as this summer. Next year will be 40 years that I'm a certified scuba diver. And you know, scuba diving is a hobby. It's something people do. They go to the Bahamas, they go all around, usually to nice, warm, pretty tropical locations. And that's how I got my start as well. But as you're going to find out over the next 40 minutes, when you love something and you dream about it, when opportunity comes, I encourage each of you, and I don't care what it is that you love or are passionate about or dream about, you can make it happen and bring it literally, in my case, to the depths of the ocean, and I encourage you guys to go and shoot for the stars. With that, we have a very short video which is going to bring you back to when Doug and I met. And this was one of those moments in our lives when my life made a shift. So it's a very short video, and will kind of bring you up to speed about what we're going to talk about.
Corporate funding for NOVA is provided by Sprint and the Northwestern Mutual Foundation. Additional funding is provided by the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to the PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
In December 1941, German submarines, U-boats, depart on a secret mission. They cross the Atlantic undetected and take up positions a few miles off the east coast. Their target is the United States.
It was quite risky because we didn't know what anti-submarine warfare had to be expected.
Horst von Schroeder is watch officer on U-123.
We closed the shore within, say, 2 or 3 nautical miles. We smelled the forest ashore, and we saw the autos, the cars running on the shoreway.
The German plan is codenamed Paukenschlag, or drumbeat. It calls for an all-out surprise attack on American merchant ships. At war for barely a month, few suspect German U-boats are lurking within sight of shore. The attack begins January 13th, 1942. After fighting the British for 2 years in the Atlantic, the Germans find America easy. Commander of U-552, Eric Topp.
Compared with the difficulties in the Atlantic War, it was a shooting of hares.
It took 1 week, as I remember, only 1 week all the time, and we sank, I think, about 10 ships.
America is completely unprepared.
And so we had a very easy game there.
January was just a slaughter. January is just the beginning.
So most people never knew that the Germans brought the war literally right here to the New Jersey shore. I knew this because as a diver, I would be exploring many of the ships that you saw them sinking. But what we never realized was that unknown to both the German government and the American government, and even to explorers like Doug and myself, one of those U-boats had been remaining lost off of Point Pleasant, New Jersey for 60 years. As I mentioned earlier, I started diving. Can we lower the lights a little bit, please? When I started diving, it was exactly what everybody thinks about diving. You go diving in a warm location where there's coral reefs and pretty fish. You can see the water's warm and blue. You have a single scuba tank on your back. But that's not the kind of diving that I did off of New Jersey. I developed to find shipwrecks to be doing diving with a group called the Atlantic Wreck Divers. And what it looks like down there is more like this. It's not pretty. It's not clean. It's actually quite deep, dark, and dangerous. Many of the things that you see down there are overgrown with anemones and sea life to the point where it's not even clear what it is you're looking at. It takes a trained eye and years of experience to all of a sudden start to recognize things, and for the sake of recovering them and saving bits and pieces of history and archaeology, all of a sudden now you're able to find things. As a diver, one of the things that we would do is go out on different dive boats, and one of those boats was a boat based out of Brielle, New Jersey called the Seeker. And the name fits because they would go out and look for new, or what we would call virgin shipwrecks. And on one of those explorations, a team of divers went down and saw something that didn't make sense, just didn't fit with the historical record. They went down and they started seeing these cylinders laying down on the bottom, large, big tubes. It was a jumble, and they couldn't really get an idea of what this was. It didn't look like a sailing ship. It didn't look like a passenger vessel. It did not match anything that most of them had ever seen before. But then they saw one feature, which was a hatch based on an angle that seemed to imply this could be a submarine. Well, at the end of that diving trip, they planned to keep it a secret. They said they were not going to tell anybody what they had found. They were going to go back the next weekend. Well, when they went out the next weekend, they started diving the wreck, but then one of the divers, a gentleman named Steve Feldman, had a problem. And he passed out underwater, and on the way up, he was lost. He let go of the anchor line, and he drifted away. Now, I need to explain to you that the type of diving we're talking about is nothing, again, like what you would do in the Bahamas or in Curacao or any of these tropical locations. The shipwreck they found was at 220 feet, and breathing air in a scuba tank at that depth is the same as having 5 martinis. Now, I know none of you guys should know what a martini is like, but can you imagine drinking 6 martinis on an empty stomach? You become inebriated. And this is called narcosis. And the thing about narcosis is that if you're in warm, clear water and you're having a good time, well, then you'd be euphoric or happy. But if you're in dark, cold water and you have a sense of foreboding, now all of a sudden you become paranoid. This was the conditions in which Steve Feldman found himself in a high current, very bad visibility, trying to explore the shipwreck. And although his dive buddy tried to rescue him, he could not pick him up. Another one of the physiological problems of breathing air at 220 feet is that oxygen, one of the components of air, becomes toxic at that depth. The narcosis is because of the nitrogen, so you've got nitrogen, which is making you high or drunk, and then the oxygen, which is creating a situation of oxygen toxicity, which is probably the cause of why Steve Feldman died. Well, the secret was now out. They had to call the Coast Guard. His body wasn't recovered for 6 months. It was only accidentally recovered when it was caught in a fishing net, and the fishermen brought the body back to land. By that time, he'd been underwater so long, it was near impossible to figure out exactly what had gone wrong. Well, the secret was out, and I was invited to go with the team on the next trip out. And as I was diving around the wreck, I found a few objects. None of them helped us know what the nationality was or when the submarine had sunk. I was operating in an area that I would later find out was the conning tower, the area where the periscopes would be. But another diver on that trip had gone inside on that third trip and recovered a dish. And on the dish was the eagle and swastika in the year 1942, conclusively proving that this was a Nazi or German U-boat from World War II, and it was sunk off of our coast. As we started to explore the wreck further, I would go inside, and that's to give you an idea of how tight it is with your diving gear to try and get into the hatches that go into the ship. And it was inside that we painfully noticed that the crew was still on board. Typical of these submarines, they would have a crew between 50 and 56 men, and many of them could clearly be seen still in their uniform. The flesh long gone, just their skeletal remains stuck in the mud and silt. Now, I'd been diving shipwrecks at that point for about 15 years, and some of them, like the Andrea Doria, I knew that people had died, but I had never, ever seen human remains. I had never seen a skull before on a shipwreck. It drove home painfully and pointed that my own morality and my own mortality by confronting these situations. And I had to make a decision of how I wanted to operate, how I wanted to treat these people. Even though in 1945, they were the Nazis and they were the enemy. And if I was a soldier, I would kill them. But 60 years later, they're unknown soldiers in an unmarked grave that no expert, no government, not the German government, not the American government, could answer the simple question, who were these men, what were they doing here, and what had happened to them? I did a drawing. Now, under these bad conditions, we can never really see the whole ship. So after a series of dives, I came up with this rendering of what this submarine looked like, and it was obvious that the middle of the submarine, where the conning tower and the periscopes would be, had been blown off by some huge explosion that was laying next to it. There was a little area of damage in the back. Another fellow who was a much better artist did this rendering, which is much more accurate. And I'll take you around the submarine so you can get an idea with some of the photographs. There's that conning tower I showed you a picture of earlier, with the little hatch that the men would go in and out. That's where the periscopes were stuck out. If we go now to the very tip of the bow, you can see how it's buried into the seafloor, which kind of implies that the submarine was up in the water column, and then when the explosion occurred, like a plane, crashed into the seafloor, burying most of the bow. As we move along aft, we're going to the back of the ship. We now see that angular hatch that kind of denoted that this was a submarine when the divers first found it. And if we peek inside, we can see one of the torpedoes still resting in that compartment. Obviously very much still dangerous, highly explosive. Continuing aft where the opening is and the wreck is blown into pieces, if you look forward inside, you can see why it's such a dangerous environment. Not only is it claustrophobic, being a small steel cylinder, but there are wires and all of the equipment is dangling down and hanging, just looking to entangle a diver. And every time you go inside and you touch something, you stir it up, the visibility is such that you're coming back out in what we call chocolate milk. So it's a braille dive when you come back out. You have to feel your way back out. If we turn around and we head into the after section and look in, this is the engineering spaces. This is where the diesel engines were. And that big box was a fuel tank that would have been mounted up into the top of the bulkhead. The two wheels that you see in front of you would have been used to close the air induction valves. When the submarine would dive and turn on their electric motors, they had to close those valves, otherwise the water would come into the submarine. So moving on, the top deck, all of the exterior hull features have been ripped off through years or the explosion that sank the ship. And this was one of the mounts for a deck gun that would have been mounted right after it. So when we were exploring the wreck would claim another two divers, a father and son, who were going inside trying to find something to identify the wreck. Chris and Chrissy Rouse were a diving team well experienced in cave diving and shipwreck diving, so they felt that they had not only the equipment but the experience to go inside. But what they didn't count on was the fact that this wreck had been down there for 60 years, and there were things inside that, when disturbed, could fall on you. And that's exactly what happened to the son, Chrissy. While he was trying to extricate something that he had found that had German writing on it, he tried to pull it out, and a huge column of wreckage fell on his back. His father had been waiting outside the submarine, and when Chrissy didn't come out, he went inside in zero visibility and found his son pinned, and miraculously was able to get him out. But by this time they had stayed too long, and they then made a decision which, as surely as we're standing in this room, ended their life. You simply cannot come to the surface after spending so much time underwater. There's something that we need to do which is called decompression. The best way to describe it to you is going up a set of stairs. Imagine if you go down to the bottom and you spend 40 minutes, well then when you come up, you have to stop at 30 feet and spend an hour there. Then come up to 20 feet, spend an hour there, and then 10 feet and another hour there. If you don't do this, the gases that have been absorbed in your body while you've been diving will expand exactly like opening up a can or a bottle of soda. And can you imagine what that must be like, to have these bubbles frothing in your blood? Simply, if you just do your decompression, you alleviate this possibility. But because they were out of air and because they were in a panic, they came to the surface. I was on board the boat that day. I watched as they struggled to get to the boat. I jumped in the water and I grabbed Chris, the father. He literally died in my arms. His son, although we got the helicopter from the Coast Guard to come and take him, he struggled for 4 hours and died in a hyperbaric chamber later on. People often ask me, why do you do this? You're a father, you have 2 children. Why would you risk your life like they did? The answer is simple. We each identify who we are as a person. And when an opportunity or a challenge is afforded me, I don't take unnecessary risks. As a matter of fact, I do everything I can to mitigate the risks. But there's always the inherent danger. And who we are as people, who we are as a country, who we are as a race, is determined by what we do when faced with a challenge. I could have simply, at that point, like many of my friends, turned around and never went back to the shipwreck. Matter of fact, some divers did exactly that. They never went diving again. They saw this, they said, this is too much for me, and they never went back. I couldn't do that. It's not that there's treasure there. There's no treasure. There was no money. There was no promise of anything except an answer. An answer that one day I might be able to meet some of the family members of that crew and tell them something, not that they knew that their loved one didn't come home at the end of the day. I would be able to tell them something that they didn't know, where they were, what had happened to them, and that the people who had found them and treated them with respect. That was what I wanted to do. So we continued to dive the wreck, and as you can see, this is what we would look like diving on open circuit or scuba tanks, exploring inside the wreck, looking for clues, and finding various items that would help us eventually narrow down the field of which submarine this could be. Some of the artifacts that we recovered are nifty, they're interesting, but they did not provide any clues to narrow the field down. But some of them, like the schematic did. At first glance, you can see how the salt water has eaten away at everything inside the submarine. This is an aluminum schematic for an electrical and plumbing diagram so that the sailors on board could trace a leak or fix a problem. But importantly, it does tell us up there where you can see the words U-boat, bout, or built, or type 9C. So it tells us what type of submarine it is. And on the lower corner, it tells us that it was built in Deschemeg, which is a factory in Bremen, Germany. Using this information, we can narrow down the field of what type of submarine this was and where it was built. And that helps us narrow down the field. Other things that we recovered was an oxygen cylinder like this, which ultimately exploded. You can see how it's peeled open. But on the edge of it was a static date, a hydrostatic date, which enabled us to date the shipwreck. We knew that it couldn't have sunk before that date. So in a way, this was sleuthing or detective work based on recovering objects from the shipwreck. And I want to add at this point, one of the things that we could have done was we could have went into the pockets of the dead sailors. We had heard that there's a possibility we might find a bit of jewelry, a watch, a cigarette lighter, or a cigarette case, something that might be engraved with someone's name. We made a decision at that point never to do that. I had to be able to do this without ever disturbing the human remains. This was paramount to me. I didn't want to be able to one day, hopefully, look someone in the face and say, well, we identified it, but we had to disturb the human remains. We had to draw a line between being a grave robber or someone who's going to disturb them and answering the wreck. There had to be another way. So we only focused on recovering objects that were not in any way attached to or on the bodies of the fallen soldiers. And when going through one of the cases in the submarine, we found a set of cutlery, knives, forks, and spoons. And this particular knife was interesting because in the handle of it, it had the name Horenberg. Now, when we contacted the German Navy, we found out miraculously, in all of World War II, there was only one sailor on the U-boats with the name Horenberg. His name was Martin Horenberg. That's it. We must have figured it out. Unfortunately, Martin Horenberg and his submarine were sunk by an American aircraft off Casablanca, off North Africa. So it's not possible that this could have been his submarine. So that knife must have been a fluke. Somebody either stole it, borrowed it, maybe. We have no idea. But it was clearly written in the history books that Martin Horenberg and his submarine were sunk off Casablanca. So we had to go back to the wreck. One of the areas that we had to go in was at the far end of the diesel engines, an area that we had never gotten to because it was obscured by that oil tank and some other equipment that blocked the path. But we had heard that in the other side of that compartment there would be these boxes with identifying marks, basically the number or the name of the submarine. All we had to do was get through there. The problem is, at 220 feet, you don't want to take off your equipment. You need your life support, quite literally, life support, on your back. But the answer was tantalizingly close, literally only 20 feet on the other side of that obstruction. So my partner John Chadden and I came up with a plan where he was going to fit on the space above that diesel engine and swim through and try to find a box that had this plastic tag. After 6 years and 3 of our friends dying exploring this ship, we recovered one of the boxes. And we were shocked and surprised when we found out that the U-boat number was U-869. That was the same exact U-boat that Martin Horenberg was on. So how is it possible that this boat that was supposed to be sunk off Casablanca was off the coast of New Jersey? Well, looking back through the records, we found out that the British Admiralty had been, they had broken the Enigma code, and they had been listening to the German submarines and their command talking, and they never let anyone know this during the war. It was one of their top, or as they referred to it, ultra top secrets. And during that time, they had gotten a transmission ordering U-869 not to go to Casablanca, but to New York. But then the German High Command changed their mind and said, no, you've used too much fuel, do not go to New York, go to Casablanca. Well, the war ended and they never heard anything else from U-869. U-869 had slipped through the cracks of history and been forgotten. Its end written off for Casablanca when an airplane had attacked something that it thought was a submarine at night. It was probably a whale. We'll never know what it was saying. But what we do know is that the U-869 and her 56-man crew are now off the coast of Point Pleasant. By finding that tag, we positively, absolutely identified all of these people and now could start putting the faces to these bones that I had been seeing for 6 years. And this is Martin Horenberg. And the captain of the ship is Lieutenant Neuberg, and his first officer, Siegfried Brandt. Using this information, I went to Germany and I started to meet with some of the families, and one of the families I met with was the youngest sailor on board, Otto Britzius. His sister lives here in America. She immigrated here after the war. She speaks English, and she went back to Germany with me. She's married now, and her name is Barbara Bowling. With her, I met with 17 of the families, and one of the things that I started to come away from this was not that these were Nazi sailors, but as I met with their families and got to know them better, they started sharing with me some of their photos, some of the stories of these people, some of their letters that they wrote home. And I found out that they were no different than us, meaning that in their letters home, they wrote the same things that I would write if I was at war. How's mom doing? How's grandpa? I heard he was sick. How's my daughter doing? It was the same questions, the same answers, the same concerns. As I looked at their photos, I realized that although they were wearing the clothing of an enemy, when I looked in their photo albums, I didn't see an enemy anymore. I saw a father and his son sailing. These were the people that I had found. These were the people that laid anonymous on the bottom of the ocean. These are the people that was so important to me to make the difference of not disturbing them and treating them with respect rather than disrespecting them just because they were the enemy. Of all the pictures and conversations I have with families, this is the one that bothers me the most. This is Siegfried Brandt. He's the first officer. And when I met his brother, he told me that to the day that their mother had died, she couldn't look at this picture without crying because she never saw, as she said, an underwater warrior. She saw her little Ziggy sleeping, tired. And that just drives the point home that no matter what side of the fence you're on, we're all people. We all have the same feelings and emotions. Somehow, some way, other people took notice of the story, the way I'm telling it to you now, because I'm passionate about it. I dedicated 6 years of my life to this. And it became a documentary film. The film that you saw a little bit of in the beginning, which is called Hitler's Lost Son. That won an Emmy, and a writer who lived in Chicago, a guy named Robert Curson, had saw the film, called me up out of the blue and said, hey, I think this is a great story. It could probably be a really good book. I didn't see that. All I had seen was the story of my life for 6 years, which surrounded technical diving, deep, dangerous diving, the type of diving that cost 3 people their lives. It was a World War II story, a bona fide enigma, one that it took 2 regular guys, as I like to say, mooks from New Jersey, to figure out, because no expert, no PhD, no government could do what we did, which was to go in there and find the answer. And we didn't find the answer for a book or an Emmy Award-winning film. We did it because it was the right thing to do. Somehow people take notice when you do the right thing. And this book actually became a New York Times bestseller. And so finding the submarine was one moment in my life where doing the right thing made a difference. When Robert Kirsten called me up and said, hey, I want to write this book, you know, I got to tell you, when someone wants to open every closet in your life, wants to speak to your mom, your high school teacher, and just basically interrogate everyone to find out the truth behind who you are and what you did, and then write a book about it, it's disconcerting. It's actually disturbing. There's people who've read this book come over to me and they know more about me than some of my close friends because it's in the book. So there's a jump of faith there to allow someone in your life like that. But doing that, again, opens up more doors. After this book was out and the documentary film, we received a phone call, my partner John Chatterton and I, from A&E. They had seen the documentary and they heard that the book was coming out and they're like, hey, we want to do a television show. It's about diving and mysteries. I'm like, I've never been on TV before. I've never acted. I fix windows for a living and I go diving on the weekend. They're like, it's okay, you can do it. Well, we took a gamble. We did six shows that first year. They became a hit. And ultimately, I would do 6 seasons and 56 episodes, or 56 hours of a program called Deep Sea Detectives. I traveled around the world diving shipwrecks, cave systems, airplanes and rivers, and probably one of the most challenging things I ever did, which was going looking for monsters in Loch Ness. Great opportunities to really expand and just do everything I've ever wanted to do diving. And all I had to do was talk to the camera. All I had to do was find inside me the strength to talk to a lens the way I'm talking to you. To be emotive, to be true, be yourself. And somehow that was successful for me. It worked for me. And enabled me to go to places where I never thought in a million years a kid from Brooklyn could go. Now, I told you earlier I wanted to be an astronaut. And you're looking at me wearing a Nomex flight suit. On my arm is the American flag. Over my chest, on one side is my name, and the other one is the mission patch. I climb an aluminum ladder to get into a steel sphere. But instead of going up into space, I'm about to go 2.5 miles down to what is arguably the greatest shipwreck in the world. Because of the things I have done, because of my chutzpah, if you will, to push forward and not allow fear to govern my decisions, somehow, some way, I found myself at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in a Russian submersible, exploring the Titanic. I made a series of dives, and then wound up self-producing 4 different programs, not only about Titanic, but her sister ship, which I'm going to get to in a minute. Everybody knows the story of Titanic. I mean, I'm sure everyone in this theater has seen James Cameron's iconic film. Before that, the story of Titanic has stayed with the global conscience. Everybody knows this tragic tale of this iconic ship that sinks on her maiden voyage, taking 1,500 people to a grave. Not in a storm, not because of an act of war, but on a beautiful, calm, flat night when the stars are twinkling. It's horrifying. That work that I did, another person decides to write a book about me and write about the things that I have done, and it did really well. Some of the questions that we had answered on Titanic led us to her sister ship. Now, most of you know the story of Titanic, but you don't know that she had 2 sister ships. One was the Olympic, and the other one was Britannic. Now, these 3 ships were called the Olympians after the first of the class. And Britannic, during World War I, was converted into a hospital ship. But if you look at her, you can see she's exactly the same as Titanic. Most people don't know that. And combining all of this, I love when personal stories in some way connecting them all. This beautiful young woman's name is Violet Jessup. Violet Jessup served as a stewardess on board Olympic, the first ship of the class. She did such a good job, she was elevated to a first-class stewardess position on the brand new White Star liner, Titanic. Violet Jessup found herself, fortunately, 1 seat in a lifeboat that night when Titanic sank. A few days later, she arrives in New York City penniless. Everything she owned at the bottom of the Atlantic, only thing she had was the clothes on her back. The White Star Line was kind enough to send her back to the United Kingdom free of charge, where now she has no job. With the onset of World War I, she volunteers, like many patriotic Brits, to serve her country, and in this capacity, she's a nurse. Lo and behold, as an oddity of history, Violet Jessup finds herself on the 3rd Olympiad on Britannic on November 22nd, 1916, almost 100 years ago to this month, when it strikes a mine and sinks in 55 minutes off the Kia Channel. I've spent the last decade, going back, starting in 2006, exploring this ship. So I went there in 2006 for the History Channel. One of the things we do is we need to take cameras, and I think you'll get a kick out of some of the camera systems, because if you look at them, they're almost as big as a car engine. As a matter of fact, they're so heavy, we've got to put them in the water with a crane. Also, the diving that I do has changed. Instead of using that open-circuit scuba tanks, now we're using closed-circuit rebreathers, which have much more in common with the equipment that our astronauts use when they walk in space. It recycles the exhaled gases, scrubs out the carbon dioxide. The scuba tanks under the diver's arms are just there as bailout, a spare parachute, something to keep you alive in case the rebreather malfunctions. This is what we look like under the water, and you can see the size of that camera. This is the edge of Britannic at 300 feet, and a diver up there. Notice there's no bubbles. These rebreathers give us the ability of spending literally hours, up to 12 hours, underwater, regardless of depth. Next time I would go back with an even bigger boat. And this one was even cooler. In 2009, I went back with the Commandant Fort Colt. And anytime you guys have an opportunity to go on a boat with a helicopter, I encourage you to do that, because it's really cool. You get to go up in the air and see the big-eye view. And this was before we had drones, but still, you can get an idea of the island of Kia. You can see the 2 support divers, and I've seen many of you could probably make out the divers. The water is so clear here in the Aegean that you can see the divers decompressing. In 2015, last year, and this year, I went with the Russian Geological Society, and they had an even better boat. Not only does this one have a platform and an elevator for the divers to get in and out, but it has a series of submersibles that we would be able to use. This is a Triton 3-man submersible that you can see being launched. And so not only would we be doing the dives with divers, but we would be using the 3-man submersible. Obviously, it looks like it's a really cramped environment in there. You can get an idea. Now, if you put 3 fat guys in it, all of a sudden, you can get a little claustrophobic. But again, because you're in a 6-inch acrylic sphere, you don't have that feeling of claustrophobia. As a matter of fact, you've got nearly 180 degrees of unfettered visibility, which is really good because you now can put the camera systems inside the submarine with you rather than outside. So here we're shooting 5K, and this is again at 300 feet. You can see a 1-man submersible right below us. So there's 3 men in this submarine. And as you get the idea, you've got this unfettered view, which is perfect for not only observation, but also for taking images. Not only were we using the 2 submersibles, but we're using an ROV that can monitor what we're doing. This is the control station on board the U-boat navigator, the vessel. And why are we doing it again? Because this is an incredibly beautiful shipwreck. Here's a view of the stern of the Britannic with a diver there, and you can just make out the 3 propellers. During the sinking, only 36 people, and I say only 36 because there were 1,100 people. Thankfully, no wounded soldiers, just doctors, nurses, and the crew. They had already dropped off the wounded soldiers when the explosion occurred. And the only fatalities that occurred that day were from that large propeller when, without waiting, they launched the lifeboat, without waiting for permission from the captain, and the lifeboats were drawn into the still-moving propellers. In one of those lifeboats was Violet Jessup. This is another idea to give you a sense of scale. Here's the submersible underneath the rudder. There's the lower propeller, the middle propeller, because there's a triple screw, and in this one you can actually see all 3 propellers with the 1-man submersible. The ship stands off the seafloor 100 feet. It's a 10-story building laying on its side, nearly 900 feet long. Everything about them is Olympic. So when you get an idea of how small a diver is, and you can see that the wreck is intact, you can see that layered ice cream cake, if you will, upper structure that is so iconic of a transatlantic liner. What is it all about? Well, here the ship broke apart when it hit the seafloor. And then there's, in this photo on the right, you can see a small door being lit. My goal as a diver was to work with the submarines and that diving bell to go into the shipwreck. And as you can see from this photograph, it is incredibly intact. Inside the shipwreck is an anaerobic environment, meaning there's no oxygen, so that everything is still protected. This is 100 years old. That's a spiral staircase. You can still see the linoleum floor. Our goal is to go inside the shipwreck and find out why she sank so quickly. She sank 3 times faster than Titanic. And our theory was that one of the watertight doors were open. So what we would do was go in the area of the break, as you can see here, and go all the way down to this fireman's passage and swim 150 feet to go through a set of doors that we know are open, and go through the boiler room and see if those doors were open. That would account for why the ship sank so quickly. Real easy to tell you to you in this room, but if I show you what's involved, this is what it looks like going down that long hallway. When you get to that end of that hallway, there's the first of the open watertight doors. When you pop into that next vestibule, that's a boiler room. To give you an idea of what it looks like, this is a CGI of the boiler room. This room's 100 feet wide. 100 feet wide, filled with 4 huge boilers. And of course, the whole shipwreck is on its side. So if we want to navigate through here, we've got to think of everything being knocked askew out of 90 degrees. So here's another idea of what it would look like if we show it on a CGI. And this is the space that I have to fit through as a diver, that little triangular space in between the tanks. Well, here's another CGI of what it would look like, and that's what it really looks like. You can see rusticles hanging off the top, because again, this is a dead and anaerobic environment. No current, no light, no oxygen. When you get through the end of the compartment, the answer was, is the door like this, closed, or was it open? And what happened to Violet Jessup? Did she survive? Well, I know how you can find out, because I've written a book about it. And with that, I would like to just thank a lot of the people who took a lot of the underwater photographs in the museums that I've gotten credit from. And if you have any other questions about the U-boat story, that's my website. And I think at this point, they'd like me to open it up for a Q&A. So, does anybody have any questions? Not one? Okay, go ahead. Oh, you were just waving? Yeah. All right. Well, then thank you very much, guys. Have a great night. Oh, you got a question? All right.
Would you prefer the large-scale last shipwreck that we saw, or the small U-boat? It's a harder puzzle to solve.
You know, people ask me often, what do you like to do? What's your favorite wreck dive? It's always the next one, and I have worked on World War II mysteries, World War I, American submarines, German submarines, American destroyers, sailing vessels, passenger liners, and I think the most important is when there's a human interest story. When if I can, I'll give you an example. Recently, I worked with Dr. Bob Ballard. Bob Ballard is the gentleman who actually found the Titanic 25 years ago. And he invited me, because of my expertise on World War II U-boats, to work with him in the Gulf of Mexico. We were imaging this wreck, and when I had done my homework, I had realized that the captain who had sank this U-boat was never given credit. As a matter of fact, at the time, the American government didn't even realize that he had sank the U-boat. They refused to give him credit. They took away his ship and they sent him back to school. Well, I found out that he had passed away, and what I had done was contacted with Dr. Bob Ballard, the United States Navy, and 70 years later, posthumously, we got him a medal, the Legion of Merit, with a V for Valor, because it happened in combat. And as I stood in the Pentagon with the Secretary of Navy, Ray Mavis, watching this officer's son receive that medal, I realized that we, as divers, can really make an impact and a difference in people's lives. So to answer your question, if I can do something that's going to have an effect, a positive effect, even if it's bad news, the truth is always the truth, and it's never too late to do the right thing. Anybody else? Yes, sir?
How did you get funded for the exploration of the U-boat?
Well, at that time, when we were working on the U-boat, we were just paying for it out of our own pocket. We were just doing this for fun. As I mentioned, there was never a payoff. I was never working for television. There was no book. There was no paycheck. It was just something that we did. So I worked during the week, And instead of going out like I had done for years before and paying for my charter fee to go get lobsters, spearfish, or take a porthole off a ship, now we would just continue to go out. And I spent more and more money buying books about submarines and about the U-boat war, and became, there was a gentleman who was the director of the U.S. Naval Historical Center down in Washington, D.C., who once said to me, he says, you know what, you guys deserve a PhD in U-boats because of the work we did. But again, that's about passion, and that's what I want to impart to you young people, is that it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be U-boats. Whatever it is, if you have this passion, if you have this fire inside you, you will, the world is your oyster, the sky is the limit. And again, I encourage you to follow your dreams. Yes, sir?
What are the laws regarding ownership of shipwrecks, wherever they are?
That's an excellent question. I've actually written about that in depth, and there's 2 or 3 real quick, easy answers. There is no such thing as finders keepers, losers weepers. Okay? Even if it was a Phoenician fisherman who dropped his pocket watch, somehow, some way, just because you and your property become separated doesn't mean your ownership of it is separated. But there is a clause in what we call admiralty law about salvage, which basically means that if you find something on the bottom of the ocean, you have to do due diligence to try and find its owner. If after a certain period of time you were unable to attach the owner to it, then you're entitled to either keep it or sell it back to the insurance company that may have paid off on it. So, long story short, there is no such thing as finders keepers, but in some instances, you can have established ownership, but you've got to do it through the courts. It's called admiralty law. This has been around for nearly 900 years. It is recognized by all governments. That being said, warships always are the ownership of the successive government. Although the Nazi regime or the Confederacy no longer exists, the successive government retains ownership and the rights to those dead sailors. So the Federal German Republic today now is the ward for the German U-boats of World War I and World War II, and the American government is the ward for any sailing ships, let's say, of the Confederacy. So you can see how that kind of works. So warships are always inviolate and always going to be protected under that law. So that's a short kind of answer. Yes, sir?
Has the U-boat become like a popular dive spot for other divers?
It's still a very difficult dive. Even though I'm now with a closed-circuit rebreather doing dives twice as deep. And that's another thing that I like to impart to you. It's amazing in our lifetime, the quantum leap underwater oceanography and underwater diving equipment is taken. 20 years ago, 200 feet was the physical limit that we can be diving with the equipment we had on our back. But now, with these closed-circuit rebreathers, with microprocessors and diving computers, better lights, better systems, and better diving techniques and gases, I've been diving myself almost to 600 feet as a scuba diver. Other people have been down to 1,200 feet. So that's 1,000 feet deeper. So the world is getting a little bit smaller. There's still plenty of places for you guys to go look. So that's the short answer. Yes, Steve?
Do you ever regret not going into the skeletons' pockets and in hopes to find more information?
You know, that's a great question. As a matter of fact, Robert Person, the writer of the book, actually asked me that. He says, knowing what you know now, 3 people died, but you could have possibly answered the question by doing that. I think what I told him is the same thing I'm going to tell you. He says, you don't know what you don't know. I didn't know my friends would die. And if I did, you still have to be true to who you are. I didn't kill those men. They took risks and inherent risks, and in some cases took unnecessary risks. And again, I don't want to get into too much detail about it. If you'd like, read the book. It's really a well-written book. But the reality is I still have to be true to myself. And I can look anyone in the eye, including the family members. That's another reason why I don't show any photographs of human remains, because I wouldn't want to disrespect someone. And each one of them would always look, if you show a picture of a skull, they'd always see that as their brother, their uncle, their dad. So that's why I don't do that. And that's why, to answer your question, no, I feel comfortable in saying that what we did was the right thing. Yes?
When you started
still have with like the fear of dying, like when you, like because it's dangerous when you did the bigger dives and the bigger ships, you're afraid that you get stuck and what happened to you?
It's a very good question, and I'm going to say I'm never really afraid any more than you would be getting on a roller coaster, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I never ever think that I'm going to die, because if I think that, then I'm not either properly trained, equipped, or ready for this dive, and I shouldn't be doing it. So what that means is that I am making educated decisions with the proper equipment, redundancy systems in case something fails. We never only have one system. We always have a bailout. Okay? So if something went wrong, I've got an ability to go to something. And we also dive in teams. So 2-man, 3-man, 4-man teams. So there's layers of bailout. But more importantly, it's about you. It's about where you are in your ability. You build to things. You know, anybody who does rock climbing here in a rock climbing wall is, pretty happy with that, but you wouldn't go to Everest, you have to build to it. So the level of diving that I'm doing, the equipment that we're using, the things that we're doing, we build to it. And even after a long winter period of, let's say, not diving for 3 or 4 months, I still, once again, build back up. The muscles need to be reawakened because they atrophy. Not only the muscles, physical muscles, but your mental muscles and your memory muscles of how to do things in an emergency. So the short answer to your question is I'm never more concerned, I would say I'm concerned, but I'm never really truly afraid. When I was young, and I was first diving the Andrea Doria, I can remember I was afraid. I felt I was out of my league, and I can remember not even being able to muster spit to clear my mask. I was having trouble because I was so concerned. And there was many factors about that. The first time, it was my first time that I would ever dive the Andrea Doria. And the week before, a gentleman had died on the Andrea Doria. And everybody was talking about it. So as I'm sleeping, going out there, this is what's in your head, and it just builds up your fear level. That being said, I said something to my dive buddy, and he said, look, we're just dive. We're not going to go in. We're just going to go down. We're going to touch the wreck. We're going to stay outside. Everything's going to be copacetic. And so the muscles got built up, and then I went from there. So if anything you do in life, you have that kind of apprehension and fear, that's your body giving you a warning. You shouldn't be doing it. There's something going on. Either you're not trained, you don't have the right equipment, or you're not ready. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
When I find out that the U-boat was actually mislated by the British Army, which is one of the top secrets for their government, does the British government or American government have ever stopped you from spread the message public?
Well, what happened was the British would never have wanted us to know. They didn't want anybody to know that they had broken the German code. It actually came out accidentally. And all of those records, you can remember, this is 60 years later. And by that time, meaning that we found the wreck 60 years after the events, it had lain on the bottom of the ocean, forgotten for 60 years. And all of those records languished in boxes. No one had access to them. So it wasn't a big concern. And one of the places we never went to was the British government. The wreck is a German shipwreck. It's off the American shore. So you can see how it was missed. It was only after the fact that we had positively identified it as the one that was supposed to be sunk off Africa that we really started looking into what all intelligence services had. And again, that's part of the mystery of how we figured it out that kind of makes it like a really good detective story.
Did you ever encounter like any dangerous animals while you were?
The most dangerous animal I encountered diving is another diver. Because, to be honest with you, I've been diving with sharks. I've been diving with some of the biggest mammals in the world, which is sperm whales, which is incredible. Some of the largest fish in the world, which are whale sharks. I treasure each of these interactions with these wonderful beasts. I'm not a fish guy. I'm a shipwreck person. That's what I love. But you can't dive shipwrecks and not be in this wonderful environment where these great animals come around. So I really do enjoy them. So I've been in the water, and treat sharks like big dogs. If you don't pull their tail, they're not going to bite you.
Where do you see the next level of sea exploration going through? What's the next phase?
I really believe that technology is going to allow us to, something that they refer to as the electrolung, is that salt water has oxygen in it. There'll be a membrane where there'll be a device on your back which, instead of you having to carry your oxygen, it'll just draw it the way fish do. Fish draw oxygen directly from the water. They breathe water, they breathe in the oxygen. I believe that that'll be the next advancement. Not necessarily gills in people, but a device that will be able to draw oxygen from seawater and allow us to breathe at depth. I believe that's going to be the next big leap. And with what we're doing today, I think it might be in my, I hope it'll be in my lifetime.
And do you see habitation being a viable?
You know, in the shallows possibly, but at this point, given what the problems are with the physiology of human beings, some of the Sea Lab and Man in the Sea projects that have been going on for the last 40 years have established that people, or terrans, terrestrial people living at atmospheric level, once we go deeper than 30 feet, our body absorbs gases equal to the water pressure around us. And as you heard me say before, if you come right up, those gases will expand, much like the Coke bottle, which is called decompression sickness. So, could people live underwater? Absolutely, but they would not be able to live underwater and just come up and down like you can with these staircases. You'd have to decompress. And that's some of the complexity to it. So, is it possible? Yes. Is it foreseeable? Maybe. But I think it'll always be exactly like what we're seeing with the space program, where rather than you being engrossed or in your environment, you'll have to be cocooned from it like we are in space. Yes?
Do you think the Loch Ness Monster is real?
I've actually been diving in Loch Ness, and let me tell you, the spookiest thing I ever did was going diving at night off Urquhart Castle in Drumnadrochit, Scotland, looking for monsters. And I'm not going to tell you if I found it. I was sworn to secrecy by the History Channel. I can't tell you if it's real or not. Yes, young man.
The guy who helped find the gold fleet?
No, I wish I was. I have a nicer car. In the back.
If you find like a Golden Age pirate ship and there's a bunch of like gold coins in it, is it legal to take the gold coins and like get rich off them?
Well, I heard pirate and gold coins and you've got me interested, so if you know where one is, come on down here and let's talk. But I have found some treasure on ships, most of it just coins and things that are valuable to collectors, but if you're thinking like the big pile of gold, not yet. Not yet. I'm still looking though, but you can find it.
I wanted to wrap it up now. We can come up front. If you'd like to buy one of these books and autograph it, you can buy it. I'll sign you up and come off your student account. It's pretty cool to have. Before we say thank you, I want to say two things about Blair Academy. There's a little connection here. One, we had a science teacher, Larry Jolene, who had the bends. He came up too quickly and he couldn't walk very well. And he actually dove with Jacques Cousteau, the first guy to use one of those tanks, and who invented it off the Adriatic coast. The second thing, a Blair-related story, is that we had a Blair parent who dove with Dr. Ballard to the bottom of the sea. How far was it? 2,000 feet?
Well, it depends where, but it could be
thermal vent.
Thermal vents, can they be anywhere between 1,500 feet and 12,000 feet? So.
He was somewhere, I think he was somewhere around 8,000 or 10,000 feet to the bottom of the sea, and he named one of the thermal vent areas for a Blair student, his daughter. So it's kind of cool that down there there's a name of a Blair daughter. Yeah. And lastly, we're going to thank Richie Kohler, not only for a story that's fascinating, but you realize he's talking a lot more than just about the sea. It's about all of our lives, and we really want to thank you.